Okay, good morning, everybody. Yesterday, on some Jewish calendars, it was Yom HaShoah, which is technically called Yom HaShoah v'Hagevura. It's not just a Holocaust Memorial Day, but it's a day of remembering the Shoah itself, but also the tremendous acts of Gevura, of courage and strength that despite the horrible conditions that the Jews faced at that time, there was tremendous resistance and survival despite horrible odds. It was a unique situation in history, one that in scale never existed before. We had tremendous tragedies. We had the Crusades, we had the Rheinfleisch massacres, we had the Khmelnytsky uprising. And all of those events have been memorialized in piyutim, in commemorations. On Tisha B'Av, we recite a lot of those things. During the year, many communities would recite piyutim. You'll still find in some of the art scroll machzorim, most shuls don't say it anymore. We used to say it growing up before Shabbosim, before Pesach. My shul used to say piyutim. The fact that we say Alpha Rachamim in our davening on Shabbos is the result of the Crusades. It was composed as a result of the Crusades, and we still, and even last Shabbos when we bench Rosh Chodesh, and normally when you bench Rosh Chodesh, you don't say Alpha Rachamim. We said it because of the Crusades happened this time of the year. The Shoah was declared a day of mourning by the Israeli Knesset, and it's commemorated in Israel, of course. The siren goes off. Unfortunately, the more traditional members of our Jewish community never acknowledged officially the Shoah. It's a stain, I think, on the rabbinic authority. Understandably, they don't want to introduce new observances. On Tisha B'Av, we recite some kinos and piyutim referring to the Shoah, but that's only in recent times. Rav Schwab wrote a kina, the Baba Rebbe wrote a kina. A few piyutim were included about the Shoah, but there was no official recognition of the Shoah for two reasons. Because it was proclaimed by a secular, non-religious government, Israeli government, and they want nothing to do with that. Plus the fact that, as Rav Soloveitchik himself noted on a number of occasions, that it's not for us to introduce new observances into the Jewish calendar. So they said you could commemorate the Shoah.
You can't things like that.
But the reality is,
you get better, you take one step forward before step backward.
The reality is that people don't celebrate or commemorate the Shoah on Asar B'Teves. And Yom HaShoah has become the official commemoration, but still in the more right-wing communities, it unfortunately is not acknowledged, even though they suffered as much as anybody else. And that's an unfortunate thing. Being called Yom HaShoah v'Hagevura, I want to focus on one aspect of Gevura. We know there are partisan groups. We know that 80 years ago, on the second night of Pesach, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising took place, even though it was doomed to failure. But the initial uprising, by the way, did rout the German army until they brought in, the next day, they brought in their tanks and leveled the ghetto. But the initial part of the uprising was successful. And that's why it's called Yom HaShoah v'Hagevura. But I want to focus on a different type of resistance, what I like to call spiritual resistance. Despite what took place during the Shoah, and it was horrendous, you can't even begin to imagine, unless, like Mr. Bowski, you were there, and others who survived. Today we have a levaya for Dr. Bichler, who also survived. His story is a little bit different because his family went through the Holocaust in Siberia. which is a little different than most people who went to the camps in Eastern Europe. Siberia was a whole different experience. He wrote 2 books about it. In any event, despite the horrible conditions that Jews were placed in ghettos and in camps and work camps, and all the difficulties that they encountered with the horrible Nazi soldiers and the things that they did to them, despite it all, the observant Jewish communities still clung to their traditions, despite the most horrible conditions. There are people that went through the Holocaust not eating non-kosher food, practically starved themselves to death. But how could you eat treif, even though that's all they gave you to eat? People went, and people did that. People tried to daven. People tried to smuggle tefillin. People tried to observe Pesach. I mean, in the most horrible, horrible conditions. And on top of that, what I want to focus on this morning, they asked shilas. They asked questions of the rabbinic leaders that they found, how to observe halacha in the midst of the most horrible circumstances. And some of these questions are heartbreaking, and they found answers. So they tried to find answers. Some questions they couldn't answer. And of course, they didn't have libraries to consult. Sometimes they did. Sometimes the Nazis wanted to preserve the cultures of the people that they destroyed, so they made libraries. And occasionally, they put a rabbi in charge of a storehouse of Sfarim to preserve it for the future. And that's how he may have access to some sources. But the fact that they even asked questions. Picture the following scene. You have every so often, they would have an axion, a gathering of people, because they had to submit a certain number of people to the camps. The trains were running, and they had to get a certain number quota you had to fill. And every morning you had to come to whether it was the Umschlagplatz or whatever it may have been to gather together, and they would count off X number of people, get on the train. That was our quota for today, from the ghettos and other places. And it was known, and it was practiced, that if you bribe somebody, a guard, what would happen? So you could escape that particular day's evacuation. So somebody, Rav Oshri, Ephraim Oshri was a young man. He was 27 years old during the war. He was a graduate of some of the finest yeshivas in Europe. And he was the rabbi of the Kovno ghetto. And the Kovno ghetto had a large number of religious Jews in it. And somebody comes over to him and says, Rabbi, I have money to bribe a guard to save my son's life, because he's a starker, and they're going to take him off to the concentration camp or the work camp. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. I don't know what's going to happen to him. And they didn't all fully realize about the crematoria and the gas chambers yet. That they didn't even know yet. But I don't know if I've ever see him again. Probably he'll be killed. Can I bribe a guard to save my son's life, knowing full well that my neighbor's son is going to go in his place and probably get killed? Can I do that? That's a horrible question for somebody to decide, especially a man who's only 27 years old at the time and just beginning to feel this wave of questions coming towards him in the most difficult situations. And that was one question that Rav Oshri did not answer. He didn't answer that. He didn't want to be the one to say yes or no. But that's a very heavy question. I don't know what happened. But that was one question he didn't answer. But he had thousands of questions addressed to him by the Frum community in the Kovno ghetto. And he didn't have access to Sfarim. He was a Talmud Chacham, but nevertheless, when you're asked complicated questions, you have to look things up sometimes. And he wrote down his answers on scraps of paper, and he put it in these cans, and he buried them. After the war, He survived. He lost his wife and family in the camps. He survived. He remarried and went back dug up all those tin cans and produced now he had access to Sfarim, 5 volumes of the questions he was asked. It's called Tshuvos Mimamakim. A lot of it has been translated, but it's a fascinating collection of tshuvos. So I want to go with some of the questions that he was asked. But the fact that people were asking shilas in the midst of this unbelievable horror. I'll tell you one other thing before I get to some of these questions. Some are technical, some are heartbreaking. The Satmar Rebbe, the first Satmar Rebbe, who's a survivor, who rebuilt her entire community. He lost his family during the war. And he says that whenever you see a survivor, religious, non-religious, secular, it doesn't make a difference. Whenever you see a survivor, you have to stand up. Stand up, because they are a kadosh. They're holy people. Anybody who survived. And this is coming from a person who didn't make these kind of statements lightly. But people that ask these kind of questions are just unbelievable. So one of the questions he was asked, normally when a person dies, or is killed in this case, before burial, you do a tahara. You clean the body, you prepare it for burial, tachrich and so forth. And this is done immediately before the funeral. But what happens if you have stacks of bodies of people that were killed, and you don't know if you'll be able to do a tahara before a funeral? Can you do a tahara early? Interesting. It's a technical question, yet they asked a shiloh like that. Can you do a tahara earlier than before the funeral itself? The funeral, you don't know when it's going to take place, or even if it's going to take place. And here you are in a ghetto, starving, and you're worried about doing a tahara on stacks of corpses.
Wally,
Yes.
there were no funerals. They just threw them into.
No, I'm not talking about when they killed him and threw him in pits. I'll come to that later. But in the ghetto, people died of starvation. People were shot. People were killed. And the bodies were just sitting there and not knowing if, in fact, there would be a funeral, if, in fact, you had the time to do it properly. Make a long story short, it was a very technical question that he was asked. And he ruled that you can make a tahara in advance because you don't know if you're going to be able to do it later on. That's a simple question. Let's take another question. The Germans were very sadistic in some of the things that they did. They would, we'll get to some of their sadism in a moment, but they would kill people and then they would have other Jews dig their graves and take off their clothing and bury them naked. And they would have these piles of clothing. Now, some were bloodstained, some were clean. So the question was, can the grave diggers sort of steal some of the good clothing of the people that were killed and use them? Can you take clothing of people that were killed by the Nazis, people that were going to be buried without clothing, and can you use them for people that needed clothes, who were cold, didn't have what to wear? Now, the halacha is, Shulchan Aruch Yeridea, that if somebody is murdered and there's blood on his clothing and so forth, he's to be buried as he's found. There's no tahara. You bury a person with their clothing, with the blood stains. But that's if he still has his clothing on him. But here the Nazis took off the clothing, or they ripped off the clothing. And therefore, if you have clean clothing without blood on it, which is part of the requirement in Yeridea, he says you can use the clothing. You can take the clothing. The corpses are being buried without it anyway. And children who could benefit from the clothing either by warming themselves or selling it to purchase food to survive, primarily give the clothing to the children to use to help them in the ghetto? That was one of the questions he asked. Then there was another question, right? A young boy whose leg was amputated and he was in a hospital. And the Nazis were known that when a person dies in a hospital, they would burn all of his personal effects. And this boy wanted a pair of tefillin while he was in the hospital recuperating, not knowing if he'd survive or not, if he'd get out or not. So Rav Oshry was asked, can I bring tefillin into the hospital, knowing that there's a good possibility that if and when he dies, those tefillin will be burnt along with everything that he owned. And without going through all the details of it, he poskined that he could bring the tefillin to the boy. It would give him a little bit of encouragement. It would uplift his spirits. And also, there's no guarantee that they would actually burn everything. But as it turns out, when the ghetto was liquidated, they burned down the hospital and everything that was in it. However, before this happened, there was one survivor who managed to save the pair of tefillin. So at least for the time that the young boy had his tefillin, it made him feel a little bit better. I don't know if he survived, but the tefillin did survive, even though they burnt the hospital down. But the fact that people even ask these questions is just still absolutely amazing. Yes.
What is the halacha about a person who will starve himself in order not to eat non-kosher food?
Eat the non-kosher food. You're not allowed to commit suicide. And the only way to stay alive is to eat tarfus. You eat tarfus. But many people refuse to do that. And they practically starve themselves. I don't know if anybody actually starved themselves to death, but people were emaciated because they wouldn't eat non-kosher food. I mean, maybe they would eat some of the soup or the broth maybe, but actual tarfus, there are many people who went through the war who kept strictly kosher, who would not eat what was being served to them. If they were being served some type of a gruel or potatoes or whatever, potatoes they had, that they were a piece of bread that they would allow themselves. But actual meat, many people wouldn't do that. And I'm not saying they starved themselves to death, but they became very emaciated.
And we
Let's take, all right, let me take another question. Okay. Among the sadistic practices that the Nazis did when they would kill people, they wouldn't just kill somebody, they would play with them. That's a terrible thing. And they would kill family members in sight of other family members. They would take children and kill children in front of their parents. They would torture and kill wives in the presence of husbands. So one of the questions he was asked, there was before the Kovno ghetto was liquidated and they butchered and took away thousands and thousands of people. One person came to Rav Oshry and said, I can't bear to watch my wife and children killed in front of my eyes. I can't tolerate it. I can't do it. Am I allowed to commit suicide to avoid having to watch my family being butchered? It's a terrible question. The fact that he even asked the question is terrible. Can I commit suicide rather than to avoid watching my family being butchered in front of my eyes? And he ruled that he could not. You cannot commit suicide. Even because that would be surrendering to the enemy, in his words. And he writes after the war that in the entire Kovno ghetto, there were only 3 cases of suicide. That's amazing. By people who became very, very depressed. Now, we know in the concentration camps, the wire around some of the camps was electrified. And many people just threw themselves against the electrified wire rather than continue suffering in the camps. That we know. But here in the ghetto, he ruled you could not commit suicide because that would be giving in to the enemy. Horrible questions that people ask. Okay. One of the rules that the Germans had in the ghetto was that you couldn't have children. Couldn't have children. And a woman was walking in the street who was obviously pregnant. And the Nazis killed her. They shot her. Put a bullet in her head. Because you're violating a Nazi rule about having children in the ghetto. Can you save the child? Can you perform a cesarean section on a dead woman to possibly save the child? Because there were, and by the way, there were hospitals in the ghettos. Most of the ghettos did have a hospital. And there was a doctor who saw this happening, and they rushed the woman inside. But before they began work, and this is, we're talking seconds, minutes, where the question came to him somehow. And make a long story short, they did a cesarean on this woman who was dead, and the child was alive. But when the Germans found out what had happened, one of the German soldiers took this newborn infant and just crashed his skull against the wall and killed him. Ad kedei kach. But the question was asked, and that was the answer. Okay. Horrible questions, but they asked the questions. And that is the highest form of resistance that you can imagine.
Wally,
There were, yeah.
since you not allowed to commit suicide by not eating the treif, some of them were actually, it was a form of suicide because they were starving to death. Were they paskin that they're allowed to eat the treif instead of basically dying from?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you got to save your life. That's number one.
Right.
But yet, it's very difficult.
They wouldn't, right?
It's you people who are from people who kept kosher all their lives, Hasidic backgrounds. I'm gonna eat charfus. I'd rather die, but they had to stay alive. So they practically starved themselves to death, but they wouldn't eat treif. When it came to the point of keeping them alive, then they would eat. So somebody would feed them when they were too weak to feed themselves. There were occasional minyanim, even in the ghetto, and somebody came to Rav Oshri and said to him, how can I make the bracha Shalo Asani Ovet in the ghetto under these horrible conditions? How can I say it? Thank God for not having he made me a slave, because I am a slave to the Nazis and all different things. So he points out that Shalo Asani Eved does not refer to our physical liberty, but rather our spiritual liberty. So if they can't break your spirit, then you're not a slave. And the fact that they asked all these questions, and again, he answered all these questions on the fly. When after the war, he put it together again and he had his sources it became much more elaborate to defend decisions that he had made on the fly. And it's a very comprehensive series of volumes. Saving a life, obviously, is not a priority.
Asked you
So,
color zones.
life in the ghetto was very dangerous.
You could ask him.
Escaping the ghetto was also dangerous, because if they would catch you, they would kill you. But if you could escape the ghetto, then you could join the partisans in the forest fighting the Nazis. So could you risk your life to escape the ghetto to join the partisans? That's part one of the question. Part two of the questions, it's very well known that there were Polish partisans fighting against the Nazis who didn't want the Jewish partisans to join with them against the Nazis. So they were getting a double whammy. The Nazis wanted to kill them, and the Polish partisans didn't want to work with them. So if you finally escaped the ghetto, you had to find Jewish partisans to join and fight against the Nazis. So could you risk your life to escape the ghetto to try to find Jewish partisans to fight the Nazis? And again, in a very extended tshuva, he says, obviously, it's a question of one danger versus another danger. And he says that it seems to me that living in the ghetto is definitely a sakaras nefashos to begin with. And escaping the ghetto offers you another possibility for life. So he says that you don't want to undermine, I don't want to undermine the spirit of those people who want to escape to the forest. We should encourage them, support them, help them get weapons and ammunition so that when they arrive in the forest, they're ready to fight. If they're lucky enough to find the right group of partisans. But it boggles the mind that even in fighting the Nazis, they experience discrimination. It's very hard. Here's a fantastic question. We know that there were many righteous Gentiles who saved the lives of many Jews. We have a woman in Fairlawn. What's her name? Mrs. Infield. Mrs. Infield was a child survivor of the Holocaust. And her family survived. A Polish farmer took them under his wing and hid them under a pigsty. There's a pigsty on his farm. He dug a hole under the pigsty, and the family laid flat on their backs under the pigsty for 18 months. Imagine that. They came out at night to go to the bathroom, to eat, whatever. But during the day, and they could hear the soldiers coming around checking. A family living in a hole in the ground, and above them was mud and pigs. She was a baby at the time. And her parents wouldn't let her talk for 18 months because the Nazis might hear it. After the war, she didn't speak for 2 years. Didn't speak at all. Eventually, and it was only many years as an adult, I was able, her son was my student at Frisch many years ago. I convinced her to tell her story to the students. She never spoke about it. And once she got it out of her system, she couldn't stop talking, and she goes all over the place talking about her experience. But imagine spending 18 months under a pigsty just to stay alive. There were many, and you have Tzadikei Umas Olam, there's a whole forest at the Holocaust Museum of many people. So there's a lot of really righteous Gentiles that were out there that saved many Jewish lives to the extent that they were able to. So a woman who hid Jews in her basement, gave them food and shelter, and saved a lot of people. So one of the people that was saved asked Rav Oshi a question: are you allowed to say Kaddish for a Gentile woman who died? She saved my life and my family's life, and she passed away. I want to honor her memory, and I want to say Kaddish. And he ruled not only is it permissible, but it's a mitzvah to do so. Unusual question. Because what is Kaddish? Kaddish is essentially a praise to Hashem. You're praising God. Okay? And we know that throughout the different years, people even added words to the Kaddish. When they used to say, when they used to visit the Reish Galusa in Bavel, they would add his name, B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei haReish Galusa. In Yemen, to this day, the Jews still say B'chayechon u'v'yomechon u'v'chayei Marana Rabbana Moshe ben Maimon. That they praise the Rambam still in their Kaddish today because he was very lenient in his ruling against the forced conversion to Islam and saved the community of Yemen. So in this case, so based on that and other references that he brings, says definitely you're allowed to say Kaddish for this Gentile woman, which is an interesting question. Yeah.
There are decisions that he afterwards said he did wrong.
If there were, he didn't admit them. There are some people who question some of his decisions, but they weren't there. And again, he was a young man in his 20s at the time. He didn't have all the references at hand, and he had to rule off the cuff. But
what's the
after
question?
the war, when he gathered these scraps of paper together, then he tried to find justification for the rulings that he made. Yes, for many years. He remarried, and he was a rabbi. He died in 2000 something. Here's
Who
another
was that?
fascinating.
Wally, who was that? I couldn't hear.
Ephraim Oshri is the one that I'm quoting from. The sefer called Tshuvos Mimamakim, 5 volumes of reconstructed questions and answers that he had to answer when he was the rabbi of the Kovno ghetto, or the surviving rabbi that people came to with questions. But again, the fact that they came with these questions is unbelievable. Here's a fascinating question. What do you do about matzahs on Pesach in the ghetto where there was no flour to be had? So there was one guy who had a permit to work going back and forth outside the ghetto to do some work with non-Jews. And he had a contact, a Lithuanian contact, and he was able to smuggle in little bits of flour at a time, like a little baggie of flour. And over a period of weeks, he was able to smuggle in enough flour for them to kosher out an oven someplace and bake matzahs. However, if anybody caught him with the smoke, you weren't allowed to bring food into the ghetto. And one day, he was caught. And the Nazis brutally beat him up. And they knocked out all of his teeth. And this was the guy that smuggled in flour to the ghetto so they could bake matzahs for Pesach. But after all this, he couldn't eat the matzahs. He had no teeth. He had nothing to chew with. There was no liquid diet. How can he fulfill, and this is a Hasidic guy. How can I observe the mitzvah of matzah when I can't chew? I have no teeth. So the question was, if I take the matzah and I soak it in water, can I fulfill my mitzvah of matzah that way? Because it's soft enough, I don't have to chew it. What do we call that today? Gebrocks. He was a chassid. Their tradition is not to eat gebrocks. How can I observe the mitzvah of matzah on Pesach in the ghetto with soaked matzah when my family tradition is such that I don't eat gebrocks? So again, he answered the question by showing, which is the halacha, that first of all, it's only a minhag. It's not a halacha. And he mattered for him to, what he did do though, he had to have hataras nadarim. So he got 3 Jews, like we do on Rosh Hashanah or Erev Yom Kippur, matra neder. So they were matra neder for him to eat gebrachs, to fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. But again, they would ask these questions. It just boggles the mind. Another interesting question, which is easier to answer. There were young boys in the ghetto, under bar mitzvah age, who wanted to wear tefillin because they didn't know if they would survive to their 13th year to actually fulfill the mitzvah that they were obliged to fulfill. Before 13, there's no obligation to wear tefillin, but they wanted this mitzvah. And he allowed them to wear tefillin. And there's a bright bunch of boys that he was studying with. They're 10, 11, 12 years old in some cases. He allowed them to wear tefillin with the proviso that if they needed a 10th man for a minyan, they should tell people, even though I'm wearing tefillin, don't count me in the minyan. He allowed them to. Okay.
Wally?
Yes.
Did they say the bracha?
Yes, because they took it upon themselves to observe this mitzvah.
I see.
There are so many fascinating questions. One of the most horrible questions refers to the question of aguna. if you saw somebody going into the gas chamber and you survived the war, can a woman get remarried? Because there's nobody to say, I saw the dead body. There was no dead body. It's ashes. Can I get remarried? And he said yes. And this same question was asked to many Gedolim in other ages also. And it happened after the Titanic. It happened after 9/11. But every so often, a terrible thing happens when the person they saw walking into the gas chamber shows up 25 years later on the streets of Tel Aviv, and then the halach is she has to divorce both of her husbands. It's a horrible situation. There was one Rosh Yeshiva. There was a Rosh Yeshiva whose father was seen to go into the gas chamber. They allowed his wife to get remarried, and the guy shows up 25 years later in Israel, which means this Rosh Yeshiva is technically a mamzer, because his mother was an Eshes Ish when she married this other guy. He had to move to a little community somewhere nobody knew him to start life all over again. It was a horrible situation. But technically, they rule, if you see a person going into the gas chamber, chances are he's not going to come out. And they try to avoid aguna whenever possible. There were just, all right, one last question. It's just unbelievable. I mean, I won't even discuss the questions about cannibalism because we have nothing else to eat. You know, these are horrible questions, but this is what life was like. Here, last question, which is part of the spiritual resistance. Okay. What about giving up your child to save his life to a Christian orphanage or to the church? Can you save your child's life by having him raised as a Christian? And we know many, many children, they literally threw them off the trains to the Polish peasants. Please take my child, keep him alive. I don't care what he do to him, but he'll be alive. And sometimes they will put in orphanages, right, in the church. Theoretically, if they would survive the war, they can go back and reclaim their child. Unfortunately, many people didn't survive, and children were brought up as Christians. L'chatchila, are you allowed to do that? Difficult questions. You could also get false birth certificates proclaiming a child as a Christian. And some children were unfortunately brought up as Christians. They never knew the difference. Abe Foxman, who was the head of ADL for many, many years, lives in Teaneck. What schools he belonged to now? He quit in Shiur, he went someplace else, I forget. But anyway, Abe Foxman,
we just heard a story last night at the program in Teaneck. So it was amazing. He was raised as a guy for 4 years.
He was raised as a guy, and until eventually he found out that he was Jewish and became Shomer Shabbos, but he was raised as a non-Jew. After the war, Rabbi Dov Ber Weissmandel knew about this, and he went to the Christian orphanages, and he just barged in and walking up and down the hallways, crying out, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And he would see which children would respond. He would just go, Shema Yisrael, Shema Yisrael. And a kid in the back would say, Hashem Elokeinu. He knew that kid was Jewish. At least when they're little children, they learned to say Shema. And the church didn't want to give up some of these children so easily. It wasn't, some places they did, they acted properly, but in some cases they didn't. So l'chatchila, are you allowed to do it? And the answer is yes, only because if you don't give him to the church, they probably will die. This way, at least the possibility exists that you could reclaim the child afterwards, assuming the church.
Well,
gives it
wasn't
back.
there the story about, was John Paul, he became Pope later on, the one who
Well,
became Pope? And
Yeah,
that,
There were
that,
several.
the family promised him, I think the Christian family promised the Jewish family they would raise the kid and give him back.
That was
And they
during
went in
during
with the
Sam,
question.
during the Middle Ages, there were 3 Jewish popes. One of the children of the Holocaust became a cardinal, Ratzinger. He was a cardinal, the Bishop of France, and became a cardinal, and he was a Jew, and he knew he was a Jew. But he died as a Catholic. I mean, he was Jewish.
I'm
But
sorry, Fred, on the
No, it was this story
Yeah.
is John Paul, it was in Poland.
no, I don't
It was
think that
John
in
Paul.
modern.
And
No,
he became
they-
Pope.
they-
And he was not, he was a priest at the time, he became Pope.
He became a pope, but he wasn't Jewish.
No, I didn't say he was Jewish.
Oh,
What I'm saying is that the Catholic family had promised the Jews that they would, he would give the children back. I don't know if the parents came, and he said, when he asked them, he said, he said, you gave your word, so you have to give it back. You can't renege on what you promised them just because you want to have a child raised as a Catholic. And some people say that because of that, he may have become Pope. He may have been destined to become Pope.
could be. He was a friend of the Jews, no question about it.
Right.
What about a teenage boy who was converted to Christianity by the family that saved his life? And then eventually, after the war, he realized what was going on, and he came back to Judaism. Can you count him in a minion? Where he voluntarily converted to Christianity. He was a teenager. He wasn't a baby. He voluntarily converted to Christianity to save his life, and was raised by a Christian family. And then after the war, he realized his mistake, and can you count him in a minion? And he said yes. He paskined yes. And another last, in terms of kashrus, when you kosher meat, you have to soak it and salt it. Well, there was no salt in the ghetto. For those few times they were able to actually get meat. They would find some starving cow someplace and slaughter the cow. How do you kosher the cow if there's no salt? So the answer that he gave is a simple answer, not a difficult question, because you can the same way we kosher liver. You roast it, broil it or roast it. But these are simple questions, more complicated questions. Most of the questions he was able to find an answer for, but more important than the answers that he gave to very difficult questions, life and death issues, was the fact that people actually asked these questions. In the midst of the horror of the ghettos and the concentration camps, to still have the presence of mind and the ability to ask halakhic shilas is just unbelievable. And this is the spiritual resistance that existed during the Shoah. And this is why, as a Satmar Rebbe said, that every survivor that passes by, you should stand up. You don't judge. Some people became more frum as a result of the Shoah. Some people became less frum. It is now not our position to judge anybody, because we were not there. The fact that they survived is enough of a miracle. So I just wanted to share that in the aftermath of Yom HaShoah v'Hagavura, which is the full name of what was commemorated yesterday. It's not just the Shoah, but it's the Gevurah. It's the resistance, both spiritual and physical, that we have to remember. And hopefully that was the last time we'll ever have to do that.
Wally,
Any other
those
questions?
those
Yes.
who unfortunately were converted, okay, are they technically goyim? Do we have to megaya them to become Jew? Are they a Jew? You can't really shma.
This is a fascinating question. Rabbi Kanterfeld wrote a whole book about that in the Middle Ages, when people were forced to convert. And then afterwards they wanted to come back to the Jewish community, what was the response of the Rishonim? We just take them back with open arms? Do they have to go to mikveh? Do they have to go through some type of a scourging? Do they have to get makos? The responses are all over the place. Get a hold of that book by Rabbi Counterfogel. It's a fascinating book, came out 2 years ago, on responses to conversions in the Middle Ages. Again, Rabbi Oshri seems to indicate from this tshuva that we welcome them back. If they want to come back and they realize that they didn't, even if they converted willingly, we welcome them back, assuming that they remain observant.
I can ask him tomorrow morning. He dabbles with us in the morning in Minot.
Good. Ask him that question and be
Wow.
prepared. If he's willing to answer, it won't be a
Right.
5-minute answer.
Okay, prepared for an hour then, right?
Okay. Have a good day, everybody.
It's a miracle how we have all these stories.
Yeah,
To me, you just wonder, how do we even know all these things?
because
It's-
people wrote it down.
Right. To have the wherewithal to do that, and it's hard to believe, just unbelievable. Chas